Today's briefing is on the Olympics and religion, to explore the way that religion seems to have dominated the early headlines, with the outrage caused by the tableau of the Last Supper in the opening ceremony. And then we had the British swimmer Adam Peaty, who took part in the final after going through personal issues that were helped by his conversations with a spiritual advisor. And then, of course, we have the long-running story about the French athletes who've been told to compete without wearing the hijab. So religion is right there in the Olympics, whether it was intended to be there or not, even before the athletes got going. And to help us consider what's going on at the Olympics in Paris this year, we have Dr. Graham Daniels, the General Director of Christians in Sport, Carolyn Skinner from Sports Chaplaincy UK, Elise Ann Allen, the Senior Correspondent for Crux in Rome, Catherine Pepinster, a journalist in the UK, Professor Jocelyn Cesari, a French political scientist and Islamic studies scholar, Dr. Jenny Uzel, researcher on pagan studies on the religious origins of the Olympics, and the Reverend Robert Thompson, a Church of England vicar, who's going to be talking to us about the Last Supper. So thank you all very much for joining. And there are three distinct stories here, but we'll see if you want to join in on any of them, feel free to pitch in. But we're going to start with the row over the tableau in the opening ceremony in the lashing rain on the River Seine. And this went round the world with criticism for the way that the tableaus seemed to take off the Leonardo da Vinci painting of the Last Supper. And it's a story that's still resonating today, with the person who was in the lead, the comedian wearing a crown, widely regarded by everybody as depicting Christ, having received death threats after criticism went around the world. So I'm going to start with you, Robert Thompson, and you tweeted very soon after this tableau hit the headlines with various other examples of depictions of the Last Supper through the ages. And I wondered, what was your response when you saw this tableau for the first time? Did you immediately think, it's the Last Supper? Is that what you thought when you saw the scene?
I suppose what I was responding to was there was a vehemence of reaction against it from some Christians, fellow Christians like myself. And that was about it very definitely being the Last Supper. And then we had the narrative where some other more liberal Christians or secular people would then say, well, it wasn't the Last Supper, it was the Feast of the Gods. And I mean, I think it's both. The reality is, in terms of how you interpret art and visual literature and visual imagery, performance artists like Jolly, who put this together, are using multifaceted references throughout art history. So it can be all of those. And in fact, the Feast of the Gods itself was probably a riff on Da Vinci's Last Supper as well. So I don't really, what I'm concerned about is actually how the reactions sort of fix the meaning of art in a particular way. So I can understand the reaction of some conservative Christians, because I think it was very definitely, there were references there to the Last Supper. And I don't take the opinion that some more liberal Christians and some seculars said that it wasn't. I think that reference was there, but other references are there as well. And for example, the blue man who comes on at the end, I mean, this seems to me like a representation of a Hindu god, of Krishna, of the avatar of, so rather than something else, there were multiple layers there. And I suppose the other thing that I found interesting was how people were seeing the Da Vinci representation of the Last Supper as something which is fixed, whereas, of course, the Da Vinci interpretation of the Last Supper was something that was not uncontroversial in its own historic period. In the period prior to this in art history, most depictions of the Last Supper would show Jesus really very much as a priest would be celebrating at the altar. But with Da Vinci, you have the representation of human emotion in a very realist way. And that was pretty controversial in his own period. Of course, given the fact that Da Vinci was gay as well, the whole narrative about the one at the Olympics being a bit too queer doesn't stand up, because Da Vinci's queer himself. And of course, we have also the representation of the person who he models Jesus on, and Judas, who may be the same model, is someone who was a criminal who he went and got out of prison.
So just to paint the picture of what happened, this was a tableau on a pedestrian bridge over the Seine. And the character in the middle was this comedian who's well known for campaigning on LGBT rights. And there she was with a silver crown, like a halo on her head. And then around her, lots of drag queens and various other exotic characters around her, more than 12, as I counted. And then you mentioned the reference to the god Dionysius later, but that was about half an hour later. They had the same scene on the bridge, and they had the same people sitting behind the table, but different characters on the stage, including the scene of debauchery. Can I go to Elise and Alan? Did you see it in real time, Elise? And when you saw it, did you see the reaction straight away on Twitter, the social media reaction from people? Just tell us a story of how the reaction came in.
Thanks, Ruth. It's good to be with you all. I did not see this in real time. So I was traveling abroad. So unfortunately, I was in a different time zone. I wasn't able to catch it live. But when I caught up to it the next day, of course, I saw the images and I saw the immediate reaction. And by then, actually, hours of reaction overnight to this. And I think it was fairly clear right away. You could see the reaction almost immediately developing of people who were watching this live. That had that association, that immediate association with Leonardo's Da Vinci, that they were lined up on the table with the central figure wearing the headdress in a way that was very evocative of that painting. And so people immediately started making that association. And of course, the criticism just mounted, with many making the argument, including, at the beginning, a lot of more conservative figures, including personalities such as Elon Musk, saying that this was offensive to Christianity and that there are 2.6 billion Christians in the world, and that France chose to use this moment to offend them, basically, and to offend, for Catholics, one of the most sacred parts of their faith, which is the Mass. And so that kind of reaction was almost instantaneous. And you saw that just continue to build as time went on. And, the next day, of course, we saw immediate reaction from the French Bishops' Conference, who they were very critical. They called it scenes of derision and mockery of the faith. And that was echoed by other bishops' conferences around the world. You had bishops in Germany and Africa, in the Middle East, coming out about this. You had other members of other religions, you had members of the Jewish faith and the Islamic faith coming out and speaking out against this. So I think not just for the Christian world, but quite broadly, there was this association. And then the scenes, of course, involving the figure, of Dionysius did come later. So, when the Olympic organizing committee came out later and said, oh, this is not the Last Supper, it's the organizing committee. When they said it's not the Last Supper, it is, the Feast of Dionysius and this moment of celebration. I don't think a lot of people were very convinced by that argument. And the statements that have continued to come out have proven that. I think that not a lot of people are convinced they made, and even some of the statements from the artists themselves seem to be conflicted about this. Thomas Jolly, the creative director for the performance, had said that this was, the Feast of Dionysius. His inspiration was not the Last Supper, but two of the artists themselves, in comments to the media, had said that it was the Last Supper. And then that central figure, this DJ and then performer personality that you mentioned previously, had on her Instagram account spliced together an image of their tableau and then the Last Supper, with a comment that said the New Gay Testament. And that image was later deleted. And then she reposted something later, just the image of the tableau, saying that this is the Feast of Dionysius. So I think that even the artists were if they're a little confused about it, it's unclear exactly. I don't know that we're going to get a clear response as to what it was or wasn't, but it seems to be that there was this very clear association, even for the artists themselves. And that continues to be a very big point of contention.
One of the journalists I've been speaking to on it said it was it was notable that the French Catholic bishops made a statement because this journalist said that they're provoked all the time. So it was quite startling to see the statement come out afterwards. Bringing in Catherine Pepinster at this point, one of our journalists based in the UK. What surprised you about the reaction from the French Catholic bishops or the French in general to what went on?
I think the thing that struck me about the opening ceremony of these Olympic Games was that it was very much about Paris rather than being about France. Whereas I think the 2012 opening ceremony in London seemed to be much more about Britain. It was about celebrating the NHS and all sorts of aspects of British culture. But I'm not sure that this parody of religion would have sort of amused, I don't know, French people living in the depths of the countryside, say. It seemed to be sort of typical Parisian humour, or their version of humour, their version of wit to me. And they decided to present that to the world rather than presenting their entire nation.
Professor Jocelyn Cesari, you're joining us from the States today, so thank you for getting up early to join us. What do you make of Catherine's point there?
I would like to give a little background, because this is not the first time in French recent politics that there is a controversy of this kind. I would like to share a commercial by the Italian designer released in 2005, if I may, and that is exactly the same accusation of misusing the Last Supper of Christ. So this was an ad in 2005 that was also accused of mocking the Last Supper of Christ. And it created at the time the same kind of reaction and pushback from the French bishops. Interestingly, that is also the time of the rising controversy of the cartoons crisis. And what was striking was that in the French court, the judge was really taking seriously the claim by the Catholic bishop, by the French bishop at the time, that this was offensive to Catholicism, until there was a rise of protest against the cartoons. And then they pedaled back. So what I'm trying to say here is that we have to read this controversy in a broader context about the fact that Catholicism in France, despite the strong anti-religious culture of France, is part of French culture and history. So here we have to distinguish between Catholicism as a practice religion and Catholicism as part of the French history. So the question is that Catholicism or Catholic symbols or visibility is more acceptable to the French culture in general than other religious signs. And so today, the pushback of the French bishop against the orchestration or visibility of the scene during the Olympics goes back to this sensibility. And the French observers, all of them, even the more secular, are ready to hear about this sensitivity. But they are not ready to hear about the claim to protect religious freedom from other religion, either Jewish or Muslim or Hindu or Sikh, it doesn't matter. So here you see here a clear discrepancy because of the specificity of French history. So it doesn't mean that because the French, you see what I'm talking about here? What the difference here is that we are talking about a global context in which this scene is also read by Christians outside France because of the Olympics. And the pushback has been coming not from the French Catholic, who honestly, as lay people, cannot care less. Because as you may want to discuss later, there is a strong streak in the French public culture to make fun of religion, all religion. We have a magazine very well known for that. They paid a hard price for it, the Charlie Hebdo, that was victim of an attack, a terrorist attack because of that. And they don't only attack Islam, they also attack all forms of religion. So the French, as citizens, can deal with it. The hierarchy of the Catholic Church, much less so. And the French politics is more sensitive to the claims from the bishop than it can be from imams. So that's, we can continue the discussion about that, but I wanted to show this.
I'm fascinated by what Jocelyn's just said. I think she's absolutely right. And a lot of people have been talking about this having a connection with laïcité. I'm not sure that's quite right, although the French, of course, do have a tradition of laïcité, which is about the non-involvement of religion in government work. But the other thing that's so important in understanding religion in France, and I'm sure Jocelyn will say a lot more about this, is there's a strong anti-clerical streak amongst the French. And I think that perhaps was something that was also coming into how these tableaus were created.
Robert, when you went on Twitter, you were showing pictures like the one that we've just seen from Professor Cesari there, of different takes of the Last Supper. Do you, when you look at it, apart from this discussion about what the French may make of it and the anti-clerical streak, do you think playing around with the images like that is blasphemous in any way?
No, it's not blasphemous in any way. I mean, what's blasphemous in terms of Christian faith for me is that, children are dying in Gaza, for example, or that children are not given HIV drugs in Africa. That's a blasphemy. This is an image in art history, and artists can play around with it. It's not the property of the church. It does depict a scene, but as I said earlier, this in its own period, the Da Vinci in its own period, was also controversial. I think what made this particularly controversial, as Jocelyn said, was that there was a global impact. This was the Olympics is probably one of the largest international events, so that this was out there. We live in a social media age, so we get the reaction back. But for me, it's also part of probably the culture wars, which are infecting obviously North America and seem to be imported into European society as well. And I think there's just as many people getting upset that this was an attack on Western culture as it may have been on religious iconography itself. And of course, the particularity that all of the people were queer in some ways, or LGBTQIA+, drag queens, that is a problem for many people, both within the church and with outside the church. But interestingly, for me, I mean, if you look at Da Vinci's image himself, here all the people are white, but if you look very carefully, and they're all men, but if you look very carefully at how they're portrayed, there's a sort of queerness and campness about it, even in Da Vinci's own historical period. So for me, any depiction, like the Simpsons depiction, or like the depiction in The Sopranos, or like the depiction by Sam Taylor Wood, which shows a naked female Christ with her breasts exposed. These, in terms of somebody of faith like myself, actually are not necessarily offensive, but they ask deep questions about the fixation of where we fix our religion and where we actually fix God. I mean, what happened in the upper room was nothing like in the upper room with Christ and his disciples, however many there were, and whatever gender they were, and whatever age they were, was nothing like Da Vinci depicted, and it's absolutely nothing like Joly depicted either.
The definition of blasphemy, I wonder if you have something to say about that, Jocelyn, Professor Cesari, the French take on blasphemy.
Yeah, so the French don't, I mean, again, we have to distinguish here different levels. The French, in general, have been very much dissociated with religion. It's one of the countries where you have the less level of religious practice for Catholic and Christian. That's different from the Muslims. And in my opinion, it's part of the issue, that the French have been used, even if they declare themselves Catholics, they have been used to distance themselves, take some kind of freedom and liberty with a religious practice, because the culture, the national culture, encourage that. Meaning the French national culture is based on the idea that if you are a good citizen, you have to be detached from your religion, and more than critical, you have to become hostile to show that you are part of the rational, enlightened French culture. And I think that is something that is deep down, even in the people who would be, identifying themselves with Catholicism, they would never come up as such in the public space or public debate. And so blasphemy is not very relevant unless, indeed, we are talking from other religious groups who do not have this same posture vis-à-vis their religious tradition. And so there is no law in France, unlike there was in the UK until recently, actually until after the Cartoons Prizes, if I'm not mistaken, there was a blasphemy law in the UK. But in France, this has been gone for a long, long time. And so you can be very aggressive and hostile, which would be considered in the Anglo-American culture as hostile or insult to religion, is seen as freedom of speech in the French context. And this is a difference of culture more than of law, in the sense that I live in the US, and I can tell you that there is actually a stricter separation between state and religion in the US than in France, but the people are very sensitive to the status of religion in society, and the French are not. So blasphemy is not relevant here, unless, of course, you are talking from the religious institution itself, and that's another level altogether.
Can I bring in Dr. Graham Daniels? You're the General Director of Christians in Sport. What's your take on this whole discussion of blasphemy and outrage?
My perspective comes from the founding of the modern games, actually, when Pierre de Coubertin, of course a Frenchman, was the co-founder of the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, in the late 19th century. He fits perfectly, absolutely perfectly, with Jocelyn's analysis of a French perspective. The history behind his reinvention of the games was that he was fascinated by the impact of Thomas Arnold's rugby school and what we now call muscular Christianity in the advancement of the cause, of the British cause, of developing young people who were moral and strong. His fascination, Pierre de Coubertin, meant that he actually visited England. He was a physical educationist, actually. Spent time at rugby school, watched the curriculum, watched its impact on the universities, and used it in a secularized version as a great vision for restarting, in his romantic perspective, the ancient Olympics. So the modern Olympics and the showpiece for Pierre de Coubertin was the 1924 Olympics 100 years ago. It was his Paris Olympics. It was on his home turf, first time. So the secularism, which underpins Olympic philosophy per se, is a consequence of its invention by a Frenchman, if you like, in the contemporary culture. So certainly align, Jocelyn, to what you were describing, that was relatively new intelligence for me. So it certainly lends itself to fitting in with the modern Olympics basic approach as established by the International Olympic Committee.
I go to Dr. Jennifer Uzzell here. So, Jennifer, you're a researcher on pagan studies, apart from other things, at universities and various places in the north. We've been hearing there about the origin, the secular and Christian origin of the Olympics and what it is now. But your research takes you back even further to the Greek period. And I wonder if I could ask you this question. We've heard a lot about the tableau with Dionysius this man painted in blue with a backdrop of grapes and fruit draped over a table with the people who were in the Last Supper tableau seated behind him. What's his connection with the Olympics? How far back does it go?
I don't think he particularly does have a connection with the Olympics, I'm afraid, other than insofar as he is one of the 12 Olympian deities. And the Olympic Games were held in honour of the Olympian deities. But primarily, and far, far more than any other god, Zeus was associated with the Olympics. They were very much held in his honour. Like Robert, I'm a little bit confused as to why he was blue. Blue is definitely a Hindu thing. So avatars of gods, Krishna, Shiva sometimes actually, are often shown as being blue, which as far as I can work out is a connection with being divine, being heavenly, being the colour of the sky. But it's not something that happens in Greece. So I'm not sure where that came from. The only other possible reason, and going back to this fact that there's been mentioned that the Olympic ceremony was very much to do with Paris, is that Dionysius in some records is the father of Sakana, who is the goddess of the River Seine. So there is a possible connection there. That may be why they chose Dionysius. It may be because of this multivalent, layered association of different pictures. So Da Vinci's Last Supper, the Feast of the Gods, all of this being layered in. And actually the Dionysus figure in the Feast of the Gods does look very Christ-like if you look at it. So you have this, and he's actually wearing a crown of light, which Christ in Da Vinci is not. So this association with Dionysus in particular, it may be to do with that. It may just be because Dionysus is a very fun figure to portray, because it's to do with partying, it's to do with celebration, it's to do with feasting. And those may just have been seen to be very appropriate things to have at the opening of the Olympics. This association, I think it is worth saying, actually, we've said that the refounding of the Olympics was very much a Christian, to do with this sort of vision of Christianity. In the ancient world, in the ancient Greek world, we have this idea that is causing some of this controversy here, that there is, particularly in France, but elsewhere as well, this split between the secular and the religious, which has not really existed in any other culture other than the West ever. And certainly didn't exist in ancient Greece, where religiosity and devotion to the gods was devotion to the state. The gods, to some extent, were a personification of the state, and a celebration of them was a celebration of Greekness. Which, of course, was a very, the Hellenistic culture, because Greece was not a united country. It was made up of numerous city-states, which famously, during the Olympic Games every 4 years, stopped fighting. So any war that was going on between the states was stopped, which was, I believe, sort of the theme of the Dionysus episode in the opening ceremony. It was a call for peace. So there are these layered associations going on, but the association, and ironically, I guess the ancient Olympics ended in 393 AD, ended by the Emperor Theodosius, as being something that was pagan and not to be encouraged, as Christianity was coming to be more and more the accepted religion. So there is that. But this association between the Olympics and religion has been there forever. And I'm just going to get my own little plug in here, that in the 2012 Paralympic opening ceremony in Britain, there was a Druid ceremony that was read out by, I believe it was Rory Mackenzie, who was an army cleric, and was written by two of the Philip Shallcross and Emma Restalaw, who were leaders of the British Druid Order. So this connection with religion, be it pagan, be it Christian, be it whatever, is something that is very deeply rooted in the Olympic spirit.
Professor Cesari, that's a really, I think, interesting point that Jennifer was making there, that in France, where you have a separation of church and state, you find that there's deep attention being paid to the religious roots of the Olympics, that it maybe wasn't just a kind of comedic episode or a parody. There was something intentional going on there. And I wonder if you're surprised by that.
Not really. I mean, again, when we talk about secularism, we have to distinguish two levels. The first one is what kind of relation the state has with religion. And I want to remind here people that only two countries really separate in the world, the French and the American. But it doesn't mean that all other countries, including the UK, are not secular. And so the level of secular principle is in the recognition of other religion and the neutrality of the state vis-à-vis all of them, granting all of them the same rights. So, of course, it can be variable according to period and the moments, but that's the idea. The separation is not the dominant feature here. And interestingly, I think that the French, because they think they separate, have been the most intrusive in the organization, control of religion. I mean, the French are not only the only one, but a few other countries in Europe that have, from the state point of view, organized Islam in France, which is the most anti-secular position you can find. I mean, so you have this level, and the second level is the social level. And I think what we are talking about here is what is the status of religion in the mind of citizens, in the way it influences or not social relations. And here you have a vast array of ways that this is happening. I would say that the French are the further, I mean, again, if you look at surveys, the French are not very much sensitive to attacks or insult on religion. Again, unless you belong to one of the discriminated, quote unquote, religious minority. But otherwise, people can be very much and laugh about some of this, what would the American or the British or Latin European, like Italians, would consider insult. So there is something there that we have to look into. So what is interesting to me is that despite this diversity, and I would like to go back to the point made by Robert, the new dimension in this controversy is about the sexual minorities aspect. We are not insisting enough of that. What has created the uproar from different religious perspectives is also the deliberate sexual connotation of the scene. Which was not present, for example, in the Dolce Gabbana ad that I saw before. And I think that this question of LGBTQI is also a question that cuts across the different religious groups today, and that may even affect people who are not particularly observant, I would say. That's today a sort of non-negotiable point, like, are you pro or anti-LGBTQ? And I think we are seeing this kind of repositioning in the kind of uproar against the scene, because again, I don't think that the French, besides the bishops, I don't think that the French as such as a society has been very much involved. Most of the uproar, if I heard what our previous guest was saying, I don't see her anymore, about the social media backlash. It was a global backlash, and not by institutions only, by citizens shocked in their face about that.
Thank you. We've spent a lot of time discussing the opening ceremony. Perhaps we could turn to the sport now. And I want to bring in Dr. Graham Daniels, General Director of Christians in Sport. We spoke a little earlier, Graham. And Carolyn Skinner from Sports Chaplaincy UK. And I want to talk to you about sports chaplaincy, because Carolyn, you have been chaplain at Olympics in the past, and what that means and what's going on out there at the moment. But first of all, Graham, can I talk to you about this story that again was a front page news over here with this swimmer, Adam Peaty. And he had this tattoo on his on his stomach, which was a kind of statement of faith. And then he gave interviews afterwards where he made it clear that he'd gone through a tough time last year personally, and he was only able to think about competing in the Olympics, let alone winning, because of spiritual counselling that he had by a man called Dr. Ashley Null, who's described as an elite sports chaplain. Do you know Ashley Null? In what sense is he an elite sports chaplain?
I do know Ashley Null. He was educated at Yale and Cambridge. His PhD is in Cranmer and the English Reformation. And if you Google him or look at some of his papers, he's a world expert on the works of Cranmer in relation to the development of the English Reformation. So he's a very remarkable guy insofar as a professional academic, has been all his life. And yet, as now, he's at Paris now. He's been to 6 Olympic Games as a chaplain. I don't think he could hit a ball or run or kick straight. So he's absolutely unqualified as a sportsman, but the most brilliant translator of the Reformation tradition of grace and gratitude to high-level Olympic athletes under pressure. Quite a remarkable individual.
What kind of counselling did he give to Adam Peaty? Do you know anything about the story?
Yes, the story, and Caroline will be able to speak into this from her own experience. When you're in the Olympic Village, we'll have people there at the moment. I mean, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Christians, and there are people of other faiths, of course. But amongst those hundreds and hundreds of Christians, for example, somebody travels with the swimmers or with the hockey players or with the track and field athletes or tennis players on their tours. And so effectively, there's a chapel program where if you're on one of the global tours, not just the Olympic Games, there's a Christian meeting. It's the Bible open and a time of prayer. And of course, athletes attend those meetings who may not attend any kind of church at home, may be completely unchurched, actually, and show up because it's a pretty lonely world. When you're traveling the globe, you're not a superstar. No one really knows your name unless you're in the top tiny number of world champions. So I think it's almost the most pivotal aspect of Christian life over 2,000 years. Community. Integration into real community where you can be vulnerable. And that's led by, of course, the teachings of Christ as the athletes meet. So when there are all sorts of synonyms that have been used about Null's work and chaplains, per se, all kinds of synonyms. The reality is it's basic Christian education and emotional, relational being. That's what they're up to. That's what Adam Peaty would have been involved in.
Carolyn, just asking you then of your experience being a chaplain and how you read the story about Adam Peaty and what you believe happened in his story to enable him to compete at all in the final.
Thank you. I've been serving with Sports Chaplains UK as a sports chaplain at various events, Olympics and Commonwealth Games and all sorts of things like that. So I've had that experience in the athletes' village of seeing athletes come in and want to talk about things, whether they are of faith or of no faith. What I know about the Adam Peaty story is as much as everybody else is what I've read. I haven't had a conversation with him or with Ashley Null, but I have seen firsthand with other athletes a journey of wanting to find a place of security, identity, being free from a sense of pressure on performance. And what I saw with Adam Peaty in his interview when he got silver the other night, there was just something in his countenance that seemed to display a greater level of stability and security and identity. He was at peace with himself. He seems to have a better life perspective from what he would have described, I guess, as a crisis point a few years ago, to now understanding more about his acceptance as an individual, and that it's not all about what you achieve and how other people perceive you.
There was a good quote from Ashley Null in Christianity magazine, and he said, just because you're holy doesn't mean you're going to win, basically. And in fact, the opposite is the case. And pruning is part of the process was the phrase that he used, which seems to kind of cut Christianity both ways, really. You're quizzed in whichever position you come in at the end of the race.
That's profound. That's really important, actually, because if you're under 40, you're not going to remember this film. 4 Weddings and a Funeral was a very famous English film. And we still teach athletes to this day that actually being an Olympian isn't 4 weddings and a funeral, it's 4 funerals and a wedding. It's upside down, because there are far, 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 far more tears than there are laughters and joys at the games, because you lose. Or you get injured, or you don't get picked for the next game, or you should win and somebody beats you. So right at the heart of chaplaincy, surely, simply anthropologically, care for ordinary people, human beings, it is unconditional love when you're not achieving everything that you're going to hang your life on. And you realize there may be something bigger to hang your life on than the gold. Somebody once said, an Olympic athlete I've come across who'd won gold said, the best day in your life is the day after you win gold, because all the world's your oyster. The worst day is 2 days after you win gold, because you know you've got to do it again. And it's murder. That's chaplaincy.
What about, you see it all over Twitter sometimes, pray for this person, this athlete, they're in the race tomorrow, as though prayer is going to make them win. And then you see athletes turning up, footballers. We did a story recently about footballers, but athletes as well, crossing themselves, pointing to the sky, as though somehow their idea of God is that God is going to intervene and make them a success. Why is that such an increasingly common phenomenon?
I don't think it's common. I don't think it's modern. I think it's superstition, which would take us back all the way to any kind of pagan religion or none, surely, that human beings are so superstitious that we think if we get the formula right, then we'll please the gods and we'll be fine. It's the antithesis of Christianity, isn't it? The Christian faith isn't about climbing the ladder to please God. So these are big mistakes when people say these things or act as if you say a prayer and you'll win. The reality is that whether you're winning or losing, if somebody really did make you an athlete and put you in that lane, as it were, to parody, then once you're in that lane, you will learn a lot about faith in Christ by defeat and victory, and probably a lot more in failure. So actually the thing to pray is, God, help me to become more the woman I'm meant to be by your grace, whether I win or lose. That's the heart. That's the heart of pastoral care, I think.
There was something else I read about the chaplaincy at the current Olympics in Paris, which said that it was a place where people would go for counselling if there were tensions from global conflicts. So the chaplaincies are multi-faith, and there are people there from every country in the world, some at war with each other. What's your experience, Graham and Carolyn, on that, dealing with global conflicts as they intervene in the sporting arena at the Olympics?
From my perspective, when we've had the chaplaincy centre, it has served as a place that's not just for those of faith, but it's also a place of peace. It's a place where people can come and be heard, be listened to, that they can talk about anything that is on their heart, and they will be listened in a judgment-free situation. And I found that a lot of people have found peace in that place. You can almost see it physically as they step into whatever is the sort of the chaplaincy or multi-faith centre. There's almost a sense of, as they step in, that they know that this is a safe place where they can talk, where they can receive prayer if they want to. And there's different circumstances back in people's home situations, whether that is conflict back home, whether it's tragedies that have occurred in their own personal lives. And it's really important that there is that safe space where they can talk, where they can find peace, and that chaplaincy can play a part in that.
Graham, do you know any Muslim chaplains who are out there at the moment in the Paris Olympics? I'm just wondering, because another and the third area that we were going to talk about today was the story about France banning their women athletes from wearing the hijab. And we've heard stories that some women athletes have gone to represent other countries if they can, in order that they can keep their religious observance intact. I'm wondering if you have any comment upon that, if you have spoken to any Muslim chaplains about that, and the tension that has been caused to athletes who've been told to obey that rule. Professor Cesare as well, you made it. That's coming. But Graham, have you spoken to anyone about that?
I'm afraid not. One of the things that probably, and I think Carolyn might have some wisdom on this before we discuss it further, I do know, and this goes back to our earlier conversation, but may link to this question. If you're a chaplain at the Olympics, since the year 2000, so they've been chaplains really at the Olympics, Christian chaplains certainly from 88 in Seoul, formally by the IOC, appointed through the IOC by the local governing committee. So London chose the chaplains, France chooses the chaplains, or Paris chose the chaplains. But when you do, you sign a document called the Olympic Religious Services Policy. Now, this goes back to Kubota and the conversation we were in earlier. And what you sign is something that says religious services personnel will not be permitted to use this ministry as a vehicle for conversion or proselytizing. So every chaplain, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, and so on, right through the big religions, the major world religions, must sign that document, or you can't be a chaplain in the village. So the fascinating part for me, I think, perhaps if we go back to Jocelyn on this, would be fascinating that when you're in the village as a chaplain, there really is a divide of sacred and secular. You must keep your nose out of the sport, effectively. Stay in your lane, get out of the way for that. And yet, it's spilt in a brand new way in Paris, in a way that I've not seen before, from the Olympic Committee in Paris, in what they've done.
I think what is very fascinating to me is that for the first time, the French very extreme position on dress code for Muslim women is exposed as such, because I think that the French are the only one who prohibit their athletes, female athletes, to wear the hijab. All other female athletes from different countries can do that. So there is here a sort of inconsistency that is exposed as such, meaning this is the Olympic village, but as Graham just said, the rules are followed religiously by country. This is not just a sort of religious norm across countries. Each country has its own policy, and you see that for Muslim countries, the women are covered. They wear hijab. The French one don't, and I think I'm not follow this more in detail, but some of these French women have pushed back against the fact that they cannot cover their hair. And I don't know, I've not followed what would be the reaction, the response of the French authorities to that, because, we are for now in the joy of the opening and so on. But this will be an interesting thing to follow, because why the French women cannot, while the Egyptian women can, or even women from other minority contexts can. So there is something in there that has to be followed. Yeah.
Can I bring in TJ Lamoth, who's joining us now? TJ, I did ask you on the chat, because we haven't met before, whether you're an athlete. And you said you're not an athlete, but you do know many athletes. And you do want to contribute to the discussion. What is it that you wanted to say?
Hello to everyone. It's been great listening in. I would like to say that from a youth perspective, Graham touched on it, especially with doing the cross on the football field. It very much is superstition, but it also, I feel it's a way for young athletes to keep in mind God and religion and everything they do, because with young people, especially in the age of social media, they're very much pushed towards a certain lifestyle as an athlete. And many athletes they see online, that's something that they very much want to emulate. So by just doing the sign of a cross, that's something that keeps a lot of people grounded and focused on religion. And especially when it comes to celebrations as well, it's a way for people to see that I am a product of my religion, and I'm going to spread awareness of my religion and what being dedicated, being focused, the impacts that can have on.
TJ, that's a terrific intervention. Primarily, I work in professional football, and in the 92 clubs in this country now, 20 years ago, you really could walk into 80 changing rooms and nobody would ever talk about religion in any single shape or form. Not a chance. Gen Z, for some reason, has been part of an incredible revival of Christian faith. Incredible. You really can't walk into any changing room or club in the country, in a men's game and increasingly in a women's game in football, without Christians being unashamed to be Christians. And TJ, you capture it beautifully. It may not be eloquence, it may not be talkative, but the communication is that or that. And it's a way for Gen Z to speak of their hearts. It's a very remarkable time, which is why when I watched the beginning of the Olympics and watched the ceremony, I thought, my gosh, that looks like the Last Supper. I was watching it live. I thought, my gosh, that looks like the Last Supper. And I thought, oh, it can't be. It really can't be. In some ways, as an initial reaction, because it was so at odds with what we're seeing inside elite sport. The deep, deep respect that's granted to people of all faith and none within the Olympic Village by the chaplains. The significant change in Gen Z's sort of 17 to 24s of an openness and a respect for other people's faith. So it was such a dramatic alteration. And for me, I have to say, sitting in on this has really helped me see, if you like, the French mentality, the Parisian mentality and what they're playing with there. Really insightful for me to hear this.
Well, thank you. That brings us to the end of the hour, I'm afraid. Thank you very much to all of our panellists for your contribution to our discussion today. And I hope you'll all enjoy watching the Olympics together as we see it go through its course of action this summer. Thank you once again, and hope to see you again.